I used to think every stroke case was different. Some caused by sudden high blood pressure. Some by diabetic complications. Some by excessive smoking. But then one day, as I reviewed over 30 stroke patient files from the last 3 months, I noticed something that made me stop. All of them, despite having different underlying conditions, ages, and living situations, shared one very similar habit in the morning. And what shocked me was, that habit was not at all what we typically think of as dangerous. Not eating too much fat, not drinking alcohol, not chronic insomnia. But a very small, very quiet, and very easily overlooked behavior. That made me reflect on how I advise patients every day. I asked myself, could I be doing that same thing without realizing it? Could my loved ones be repeating that habit every morning without anyone at home noticing? And I began to pay attention. Many older adults, after waking up, do one thing: sit still. Sit for a long time. Read the paper. Look at their phones. Take their pills. Eat breakfast. Then sit again. Maybe you're doing that too. And you believe that since you're retired and not in a hurry, taking it slow is good. But I have to be honest. That very leisurely habit, which seems harmless, is actually one of the most silent risk factors I've ever seen. It doesn't show clear symptoms. It doesn't cause pain. It simply slows the blood flow, tightens the vessels, and leaves the brain unawakened at the very time it needs to be active. And if you're wondering what the habit is, I'll explain in just a few minutes. A habit extremely common, yet silently harmful to the brain each morning. I'll also explain why it's especially dangerous for people over 60, and most importantly, how to fix it gently, without forcing, with just a few small changes you can start tomorrow. But first, I want to tell you a true story. A woman in Texas. Lived moderately. Was healthy. But had a stroke after what seemed like a perfectly normal morning. And her habit, I believe, might be one you're repeating too. I still clearly remember that morning when Mrs. Nina came to my clinic with her daughter. She was a 68-year-old woman living in a small town near Houston, Texas. Her silver hair was neatly tied, her eyes bright, her gait calm. She was the kind of person everyone assumed was healthy. No smoking, no drinking, no diabetes, no high blood pressure. Every morning she ate on time, took her supplements regularly, and had the habit of reading in the living room nearly the entire morning. The reason she came in was simple. She felt a bit of heaviness in her head after breakfast, with slight neck and shoulder tension. One time while reading, she reached for water and noticed a slight tremble in her hand. But she thought maybe it was just the weather. Or that she wasn't fully awake yet. She didn't tell her daughter, not wanting to worry her. She just drank more water, sat still, and waited for the feeling to pass. A few days later, while standing up from her chair to go into the kitchen, she felt dizzy. One hand couldn't lift the cup. Her speech became slurred. Her daughter was present and immediately called 911. Luckily, she was taken to the hospital during the golden hour. MRI scans revealed a small blockage in the language area. It was a minor stroke, but enough to prevent her from speaking clearly for several days. When I reviewed her lifestyle over the 2 weeks prior, I didn't find any clear risk factors. No underlying illness. No medication changes. No sudden stress. But then I looked closely at her morning routine. She usually woke at 6:30, had breakfast at 7 o'clock, then sat reading until 8:30, nearly without standing or moving. That means after sleeping for 8 hours and lying still all night, she continued to sit still for another hour and a half without activating circulation. That meant her blood already slow kept pulling in the periphery. Meanwhile, the brain needed regular blood flow to recover from the long sleep. That gap, between what the brain needed and what it actually got, was what caused a small vessel in the brain to collapse under pressure. And then, a clot formed quietly, without noise, without warning, from what she thought was just a normal heaviness in her head. Mrs. Nina's story made me reflect for a long time. Because I knew she wasn't the first. And I also knew there are thousands of older adults repeating that exact routine every day. Not moving after waking up. Not activating circulation. Not taking deep breaths. Just sitting. Just taking pills. Then eating breakfast. Then sitting again. And like that, a behavior repeated 365 times a year becomes something no one thinks is scary. But it's what makes me uneasy. I met Mr. Jonah during a late-night emergency case at the hospital in San Diego. He was 74 years old, thin, slightly hunched, eyes still dazed as he was wheeled into the scan room. The one who brought him in was his son, who had found his father collapsed on the bathroom floor just after standing up from the sofa. At that moment, everyone thought he had slipped. But when we checked his arm reflexes and speech, we immediately realized this was not just a simple fall. He couldn't form clear sentences, his left eye was slightly off, his right arm was noticeably weak. The MRI results showed a small area in the left hemisphere had a blocked vessel, causing a minor stroke in the motor region. When I asked about his morning routine in the days leading up to this, his son recalled very clearly. Dad wakes up early. Around 6. He takes his blood pressure meds right after brushing his teeth. Then he goes to the sofa and watches TV. He doesn't eat right away. Usually sits there for over an hour, sometimes even dozes off without realizing it. After that he heads to the kitchen and grabs a light bite. I asked further, during that sitting time, did he move around or stand up at all? The son shook his head. No. He didn't walk around. Many times when I visited, he was still sitting in the exact same position as in the morning. That was a coincidence that caught my attention. Just like Mrs. Nina, Mr. Jonah also stayed in a motionless state in the morning after waking up. After a night of lying still, his body was not activated, his blood vessels weren't stimulated, heart rate still low, and blood pressure not yet stabilized. Then suddenly standing up after nearly 90 minutes of stillness became a light shock strong enough to damage a vulnerable blood vessel in the brain. When I shared this with his family, they were surprised. I thought as long as he took his meds regularly, he'd be fine. He's very careful. No alcohol, no salty food, sleeps on time. I nodded. And precisely because he's so consistent, so quiet, we overlook the fact that his body needs to be awakened. You know, the scary thing isn't that we do something obviously wrong. It's when we believe we're doing the right thing just because it feels familiar and doesn't seem dangerous. Sitting still after taking meds. Sitting to rest. Sitting to relax. But the more older adults repeat that habit without light movement, without shoulder or neck rotation, without warm water or deep breaths, the more stroke cases I see arriving in the exact same heartbreaking pattern. After Mr. Jonah's case, I began recording all the commonalities in the morning routines of stroke patients I met. And the more I wrote, the clearer it became, there's a shared thread silently connecting them. A commonality not of disease, but of prolonged stillness right after waking up. When I placed the stories of Mrs. Nina and Mr. Jonah side by side, one thing stood out clearly. Both lived moderately. Neither had significant underlying illness. Both followed medication schedules, ate simple meals, didn't smoke or drink. And both had minor strokes in the morning. But most importantly, both shared one eerily similar habit. A habit neither of them thought was harmful. That is, sitting still after waking up. No movement. No walking. No stretching, no deep breaths, no act of waking the body in any way. They just sat. One read books. One watched TV. One drank orange juice. One took pills then rested with eyes closed. All of it seemed normal. But that very normalcy, when repeated daily, became the tightening loop around their circulatory flexibility. I remembered many other cases in my records. A 76-year-old woman who knitted quietly every morning. An elderly man over 80 who meditated but didn't move his limbs beforehand. A patient living alone, who after breakfast would sit silently watching the window for an hour. All of them, despite different lives, shared one thing: their bodies weren't awakened, not moved, not gently warmed after a long sleep. In neurology, we call this state mild asymptomatic circulatory stagnation. It doesn't hurt, isn't obvious, and doesn't show up right away. But it silently wears down the responsiveness of small brain vessels. Every morning, when the brain needs blood to process, analyze, remember, and sense, that flow is delayed, held in the limbs, slowed down because the body hasn't moved. Then when that person suddenly stands up or breathes deeply after an hour of stillness, internal blood pressure shifts too fast. Fragile vessels can't take it. The brain becomes ischemic. And one small branch, usually in the language or motor area, gets blocked. You might be thinking, but I still walk every afternoon, still garden, still do gentle exercise. That's true. But the danger here isn't that you don't move, it's that you don't move at the right time. The body after night sleep is like a river after winter. It needs to be gently stirred, awakened with smooth, steady motions. If not, it will freeze while you think you're resting. I'm not saying sitting still in the morning is wrong. I just want you to know this: if you're over 60 and you wake up and remain still for an hour, you're no different from dozens of my patients who thought they were still healthy until one arm wouldn't move, or their voice began to stutter. All of the minor stroke cases I've seen in the past 3 months shared nothing in common regarding cholesterol or blood pressure. But they shared one strange little habit: sitting still at the very time the brain most needs awakening. To understand why sitting still after waking can affect the brain, we need to look at how the body wakes up each morning. Many think that when they open their eyes, all body systems are ready to work. But it's not like that. The human body is a complex machine, and morning is when it needs to be started slowly. After a long night of deep sleep, heart rate slows, blood pressure drops, body temperature lowers. Blood no longer circulates as strongly as during the day. The vessels, especially the tiny ones in the brain, are slightly constricted, like gates that closed for rest. When you wake up, the body needs a few signals to know it's time to get back to work. And those signals come from the small things you do in the first minutes of the day. If you sit still too long after waking up, those signals don't get sent. The heart keeps beating slowly. Vessels stay tight. Blood hasn't circulated fully. The brain, needing fresh oxygen-rich blood to function, is left working in a state of energy shortage. You might feel this through very subtle signs: a heavy head, stiff neck, short breaths, or a wish to doze off again even after waking. And the most dangerous part isn't the stillness itself, but when you suddenly stand up, move, or exert yourself right after. At that point, blood pressure spikes quickly. Blood rushes from limbs to the brain. But if brain vessels aren't fully open, that surge can hit fragile walls. If one small branch gets damaged or blocked, the result is ischemia, a common cause of minor strokes in older adults. Imagine your brain like a small garden. Overnight, the water drains, the leaves fold to sleep. In the morning, you need to water it gently, open the door to sunlight, let the garden wake slowly. But if you blast water hard while the soil is dry and leaves are still closed, you shock the roots. The brain is the same. It needs to be woken gently with a few simple movements like neck rolls, deep breathing, light stretching, or walking slowly. In recent studies, Researchers found that older adults who practice light movement within 15 minutes of waking have nearly 3 times lower risk of stroke than those who sit still. And the special thing is, they didn't need to do heavy workouts. Just standing up slowly, walking around the room, inhaling gently, drinking a glass of warm water, those simple acts are enough to open tiny brain vessels, warm up the nervous system, help the heart regulate its rhythm, and return the brain to readiness. Science can sometimes feel distant. But for me, it all comes back to one simple question: did you do anything this morning to let your body know that you are alive, awake, and wanting to be well? If the answer is no, then maybe it's time we learn again how to begin a morning as if it's the first time we're touching the rhythm of our own life. I understand that when people hear the words habit change, it can feel intimidating. Especially if you've followed the same routine for decades. But what I'm sharing today isn't a major change, not intense exercise, and not asking you to wake up 2 hours earlier. I'm simply inviting you to try one small action, very small, to start your morning in a way your brain and heart might thank you for. This is what I've guided many of my patients to do. And those who followed said they didn't expect it to feel so pleasant. Here are the simple steps you can start tomorrow morning. When you first open your eyes, don't jump out of bed right away. Lie still for a minute, and feel your breath. Then slowly turn to one side, and gently push yourself up to sit. While sitting on the edge of the bed, take a deep breath in. Then exhale slowly. Do this 3 times. With each inhale, you're helping your lungs open and pulling blood more evenly toward the brain. With each slow exhale, your heart adjusts its rhythm in the most natural way. Next, stretch gently, and rotate your neck slowly clockwise and then counterclockwise 3 times each. If possible, also rotate your shoulders and wrists. You don't need to stand yet. Just awaken the upper body first, letting blood flow begin from the neck and shoulders, then gradually rise to the head. After that, drink a glass of warm water. Not too much, about 200 milliliters, 1 small glass. Water not only thins the blood but also awakens your internal organs. Don't drink cold water. Warm water is easier to receive and less shocking to the nervous system. Once you're standing, don't walk quickly right away. Move gently around your home for about 2 minutes. It could be walking from your bedroom to the living room, or simply stepping around the table. If you live with family, speak gently with them as you move. If you live alone, you can play some soft music, or simply open the window, take in the fresh air, and let the morning light touch your face. With just those things, not even 10 minutes, you've given your brain a whole new start. You've given your blood a chance to flow smoothly. You've let your heart know the body is awake. And most importantly, you've done it gently, without pressure, without strain. I often tell my patients not to try changing everything in one day. Start with the easiest thing. Maybe it's drinking warm water after sitting up. Maybe it's just rotating your neck 3 times each morning. Once you've done that for 5 days, your brain will remember it as a new habit. And your body will begin to respond with a sense of ease, a lighter head, more clarity, and no more wobbling when standing. I remember one time, an 82-year-old man told me he always jumped up in the morning to grab the newspaper, then felt tired. After following these steps for a week, he came back and said, "Doctor, I still get the paper, but now I walk a bit slower. And strangely, I don't feel shaky anymore, and my vision isn't blurry." That's all it took. One small action. One gentle decision each morning. But enough to prevent a silent stroke. No one sees that change from the outside. But your brain will know. And it will quietly thank you by keeping your memory, your voice, and your clarity to live each day more fully. If you've stayed with me until now, I believe something in this story has touched you. Maybe it was the image of Mrs. Nina sitting silently reading every morning. Maybe it was the moment Mr. Jonas stood from his chair without knowing his brain wasn't ready. Or maybe, simply, you realized you've done the same. I'm not here to make you afraid. I just want you to know that some things become so familiar we stop questioning them. Sitting still after waking. Not moving. Not stretching. Not breathing deeply. We do it each day, thinking it's rest. But really, it's a gap. A gap where blood can't reach fast enough. A gap where the brain isn't strong enough to fully wake. What I hope for isn't that you change your entire lifestyle. I just hope you begin your morning again. Gently. With one slow breath. One sip of warm water. One quiet walk around the room. Just that, and you might preserve the most precious things: memory, steady steps, and morning clarity. You don't have to do this alone. Tell me, what do you usually do after waking up? Have you ever sat still too long without realizing? Do you have an older loved one repeating that habit? Leave a comment. Who knows, your experience might help someone else prevent something that shouldn't have happened. And if you find these ideas helpful, hit follow. Each week, I'll share a small story with you. Not to make you afraid, but to help you awaken. Awaken to live. Awaken to care. Awaken to love your body in a new, mindful way. Next week, I'll share with you 3 morning postures that seem harmless but can send blood rushing to the brain in the wrong way, especially dangerous for older adults living alone. A story I don't think you will want to miss.